Hello, everyone. I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One on One. I first met Kim Munley in January of 2010. The circumstances were not the best. She was still in a wheelchair, recovering from injuries she had suffered months earlier when she confronted Major Nidal Hasan, the man behind the deadliest attack to ever happen on a U.S. military base. She wounded Hasan that day and helped end his shooting spree. I've interviewed Kim Munley dozens of times since then, but never going as in-depth as we will in this episode of the podcast. We'll learn more about what happened that day, how she almost died. We'll learn about the battles she's fought since and what the future might hold. Kim also shared memories of growing up in Carolina Beach and what she called an active childhood.
I had my older brother. I had no other females in the family except for my mom. And they started hunting. I followed my brother's footsteps, basically. I was a tomboy, so he was skating skateboards. He was doing trip bikes back then, and I was racing motorcycles. As soon as I could balance, I was riding a motorcycle instead of a bicycle. So I did pretty much everything that my brother and my male cousins, because I didn't have any female cousins, shot my first gun when I was 7 years old. Mm-hmm. So I think thought I was a boy for the longest time. Started playing baseball when I was 6, and started playing volleyball a few years later, and just continued the pace. I love being active, and I always had this call I always wanted to serve my country, but I always had a call I was fascinated with law enforcement. And I was going to say,
what did you want to do when you were a kid?
Well, when I graduated high school, I actually went to Cape Fear for a little bit to study criminal justice. And, being a young, dumb teenager.
We all are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, indeed. I took a little bit of a break and just had fun, being a young adult. And a couple years later, got into the interest of being in law enforcement again. Had my oldest daughter. And when she was a year and a half, 23 is whenever I went to the academy.
Mm-hmm. But when you were a kid, mm-hmm. Did you want to be a fireman? Did you want to be a policeman? What did you want to do? Or were you just having too much fun being a kid in Carolina Beach?
Well, I was having too much fun, but I was raised in a very, very stern and strict household. My father, who I respect more than anyone on earth, was very stern on us, and not mean by no means. It's just we had instilled morals in us since we could talk, and mm-hmm. I wasn't allowed to go to the boardwalk. I wasn't, allowed to. Anybody could come to our yard and play in the half pipe and race on the motorcycles, but we weren't allowed too much to get out of our yard, we had a whole city block that we owned, right. So
yeah,
it was a big enough area. But something I just had, I've always had the heart to help people. And I over the years tried to figure out what that was going to be. Mm-hmm. And shooting guns was sort of an adrenaline rush for me. And I had, again, I wanted to be in the military and serve my country. And then I gained friends when I was 18, to 23 who were cops and police officers. And their job just fascinated, just hearing the stories and how they help people. And then the flip side of that, not only helping people, it's a self-satisfaction, obviously, but it's an adrenaline rush too at times. Mm-hmm. And finding that equal balance, it was just a fascination for me, and something that I felt I was could be a good leader in, and without being overzealous. Mm-hmm. And I tried it out, and it was definitely something that I will never regret doing.
Your dad was a leader. I mean, your dad, for those of you who don't know, Dad was mayor of Carolina Beach, mm-hmm. But he was a leader in town before he became mayor, council yes. member and everything else like that. What was it like as a young lady, teenager, and then young mm-hmm. adult as when Dad's a town council member and then Dad's mayor? Is that difficult?
Well, I was in my 20s before we got into politics, but he was always a big into the community right. and helped the community. They didn't even buy Island Tackle and Hardware True Value until I was in my 20s. But again, he was a commercial fisherman, charter captain, He also worked at GE and retired from GE, and that's when, in the last few years of his retirement, they bought the store, and he got into politics at the same time. Mm-hmm. Which, like I said, it wasn't hard to acclimate to, because that's just the person that he's always been. He's a very gentle man, unless you make him mad, which is rare. It takes a lot. And I've only seen it a couple times in my life, but I
very
hope I never.
even-tempered man.
Very, and he just has. I have the same heart he does, and he just wants to help people.
Mm-hmm. Growing up on the beach, and then you graduated from Hoggard, right? So you had that time when you were kind of a young adult, and then you decide to go CFCC, do law enforcement, and then Wrightsville Beach was your first police department job, was it not?
Well, actually, a lot of people get confused. My first actual law enforcement job was vice narcotics at UNCW as undercover.
Okay.
But not even the uniformed officers out there did not know who I was. That's how embedded I was with being undercover out there. And I did that as a part-time but full-time job until I got not hired on, but I was accepted as a reserve officer at Wrightsville Beach. And we, fortunately back then we could work a pretty good amount of hours because Wrightsville Beach was swamped in the summertime.
Oh, yeah.
And after doing reserve, then and some positions coming open, I went in front of the board and actually got the full-time position at Wrightsville Beach.
What was it about law enforcement that you liked the best? Helping people, solving crimes? What?
Well, and this kind of goes into a philosophy area, but I want to be able to have peace with myself. And if I think, honestly, that we're all put on earth to serve others, and I can lay my head down peacefully at night, knowing that I think I've tried my best to make a difference. And again, the excitement side of law enforcement was always fun to me, and learning the laws, of the state and federal laws was exciting. But all in all, being there when some people are at their very lowest moments in life, or being there, during medical emergencies, and being able to make a difference is just something that is fulfilling. You couldn't pay me enough money to do anything else.
Did you feel like you had to have something? I get the sense that you feel like you had to have something to prove, or that you needed to make good for something. Is that
not? For myself and I'm very religious. I'm very spiritual.
Right.
And I guess to prove my fulfillment in life, not necessarily to anyone specific. I did have big shoes to fill, obviously, with my father. Sure. And I could never, my brothers and I, we could never let him down. We could never do anything to disgrace him. We would never do that, absolutely. Right. But and I'm glad that platform was there, because it kept me on a straight and narrow.
What do your brothers do?
My oldest one, who was, a beach kid too for the longest time, he moved to Ohio with his wife about 5 years ago now, which was the only other place he's ever lived was Carolina Beach and Wilmington. But her family's up there, and he's happy. He's acclimated to the difference in climate. And then my younger brother is also the part owner of Island Tackle and Hardware with my parents. Right. And he's recently just got married. He's 31. And
none of them had law enforcement drive?
No. The only person in my family, it was my great-grandfather, who I never met. He was the chief of police in Tabor City.
Oh, okay.
Years ago, back in when the stills were being made and they were busting them.
Moonshiners and everything else in Columbus County.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, you see the old stories of those.
Yeah.
So then you decided to go into the Army. Mm-hmm. What was behind that?
Well, originally I wanted to go into the Navy and go into explosive ordnance disposal, and be part around water all the time since I was raised around it. And the different entities, they work different. A lot of times when you go into a branch of service, you don't know exactly what job you're going to be doing. And if you pick what they call a special force job, if you don't get past your source rating, which is your normal job if you couldn't do your special force job. Sort of like being a patrol officer, but being on SWAT.
Okay.
Then you have to go through dive school, you have to go through EOD, and the not knowing, I'm a very OCD person, and I need to know what my future is going to hold, kind of steered me away from the Navy. And in the Army, you can actually pick your job that you qualify for. And after taking the test, I qualified for everything with the exception of nuclear, because you have to be 26 or younger, and I was 27 going. I was very old, well, I wouldn't say old, but older going into the military.
Right.
And my father was nuclear biological rad safety supervisor at GE. So I kind of grew up around the instruments and decided to go into the Army as a chemical operations specialist. And
what did you think the future was going to hold? Did you have an idea what you wanted to use it for?
well, I wanted to explore to see if there was anything else other than law enforcement that was exciting to me or that I could achieve in. And it's funny how it kind of linked together, because I was actually going to be getting on with NYPD and had passed all the tests, but I was lacking 8 credits because they require at least a 2-year degree to get on, or 2 years active military. And they said, well, you know, we have a need for chemical operations specialists, which is basically EOD or hazmat response and stuff. And you would come on making $8,000 more as a starting officer. Then I said, okay, sign me up, because I already had knowledge in it from my father. And that's kind of what steered me into that specific job. And then, but serving my country, again, was something I always wanted to do. And my oldest daughter was old enough where I could leave her for a little bit with her dad, and not at the vital years of her life, and fulfill that duty that I've always wanted to do. You
said you shot your first gun at 7, and when you were discharged from the Army, you were a weapons specialist. What does that mean? You know a lot about a lot of guns, or what is weapons specialist mean?
When I was discharged from the Army, I was a specialist, but I was chemical specialist,
right.
Which is biological, radiological, and explosives. Now, I went on to the federal force, police force, as special reaction team, and became a weapons specialist and advanced weapons specialist. And even after then, taught around the United States Special Forces as advanced firearms specialist. Basically, you're put through school after school after school, and you're on the range, felt like 24/7,
right.
To know the ins and outs of, I say advanced firearms, not just pistol, not just M4, but other firearms that they use in the military or special reaction teams or SWAT teams.
Did that have any lure to, did you want to be an instructor on down the line? Because you did some instructing for a long time, right?
Yeah, I got all my instructor certifications for advanced firearms, advanced rifle, patrol rifle. Just that was the great advantage of being on a newer SWAT team, was that we were tasked out to go to, pretty much approved to go to any school whatsoever. And all the federal schools that we went to, it was something that normally you don't get until you've got about 20 years of law enforcement behind you, as say a lieutenant, or a captain. And we were fortunate in that area. The whole team was. And again, it was, we were on the range at least 3 days a week, and firing weapons was just sort of a pastime, as if you're a runner and you get up in the morning and run 2 miles. So it was something that just. I've always been like I said, I always felt like I was a good leader, and being an instructor was just another part of that, and something later on after the shooting I could fall back on.
I want to talk about Fort Hood in a little bit. What's the most scared you were in law enforcement before November of 2009? Any time that you said, ooh, I may need to think about this or anything like that?
No, in fact, it was the opposite.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I had this desire to always achieve, and the only thing, to be honest with you, I can compare it to, and I wouldn't know, but just as, some people have an affliction on alcohol or drugs, to achieve a certain feeling, a runner's high, for example. Right. I love adrenaline. It's my sort of affliction, I guess you could say.
Rush.
Yes. And I always wanted to challenge myself. And me being a short female, it's challenging in itself, but to see what I am capable of. And so I always was pushing myself to the next step. I did law enforcement local. I wanted to do military. I did military. I wanted to do federal law enforcement. I wanted to do SWAT. I wanted to, so mentally and physically, I was at the best part of my life, from all the training, from all the physical activity, and from all the leadership from my commanders and everything to lead up to that day, which I think, is sort of a divine path that was given to me.
Right. Well, you saved a partner's life one time in Wrightsville Beach.
Yeah.
I mean, I would think that that's got to be, for you, and I've told you this, and you're one of the people I most respect on this earth. But after you save somebody's life like you did in Wrightsville Beach that day, to me, that's got to be a life-changing event. Was that a life-changing event to you?
Well, just like the shooting in Fort Hood, you don't know that you're actually saving that person's life at the time, I guess you could say. You don't acknowledge that until afterwards, and you put all the pieces together, and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
With Sean, it was a reaction, again, to him being, a call of stress. And afterwards, when we realized, after we subdued the guy, what his attempt and what his intent was.
And how close he came.
Yeah, and how close he came, then it's like, oh, well, so then, like, you don't, just like Fort Hood, I wasn't scared at the time.
Right.
It's just what you're trained to do and what your reaction is. So it's
because the story is he was fighting with some guy who got on top of him and was about to grab the gun out of his holster.
Yeah,
correct?
he's trying to. Yeah.
Yeah. And how close did he? Can you remember all that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Can you paint that what happened and through your mind?
He was actually pulling someone over at the island base side of the bridge, on starting to go on the incline, and for a suspicious possible DUI. And while he was doing field sobriety on that individual, I wasn't not even a mile away, and knew that he was on a traffic stop. But then he came over the radio and said, 418 1025 with me right now, which 1033 means officer needs assistance. But I could hear in his voice it was some sort of distress going on. And afterwards, learning what had happened was somebody was walking up. This individual was walking up on his traffic stop, and Sean had shined the light into his eyes. He got belligerent. The guy was quite intoxicated, and wouldn't walk away and wouldn't leave Sean alone.
Right.
And so Sean had to redirect his traffic stop to this individual who was a possible threat, and the commands he wouldn't obey. And so Sean was trying to detain him, and they started grappling and tumbling down the hill. Yeah. And right when I pulled up, they were tumbling towards the end of the bottom of the hill. And so, I scoot down there, and he's on top of Sean face down, and he's got his gun. And I naturally just get on top of this individual and wrestle him off. Yeah. And he was not much taller than me, which is, it's tough to fight somebody who's short. I'd rather fight somebody who's over 6 foot.
Now you know the advantage that you have then,
yes.
Right? Yeah. But so as it's happening, your adrenaline's just kicking in, but then afterwards you're like, wow.
Yeah, Sean's hat's 10 feet this way, and his glasses are 10 feet this way. His radio's 10 feet. It's just like everything's sprawled out, and his duty belt is, and, I got the guy off and had him, subdued, and was telling Sean, because he was strong, he would not quit, to spray him. And, he sprayed him, and then the guy's like, is that all you got? And I'm like, oh, Lord, here we go. So we continued to have to fight with him, and finally, I got a cuff on one hand, and once you do that, it's usually pretty easy to get the other one. But afterwards, yeah, we were both exhausted, and when we realized what had happened, and then the individual ended up being one of the nicest criminals I've ever had to deal with. I guess he's sobered up, but
man,
yeah, it's crazy. But I downplay it because it's just, I've had other incidences that could have led to, a lethal situation. Sean just happens to pick on me about that individual.
Well, that's one that after Fort Hood, that one came out, and really, they talked to him as your former partner and everything else like that.
He made a nickname after that incident, and it stuck with me. And ironically, one of my officers from Fort Hood they call him Mighty Mouse too, and he actually has a tattoo. So
Tattoo.
we would share that story way prior to Fort Hood incident. And then when Fort Hood happened, Sean told the world.
Yeah. How did you get to Fort Hood?
That was my last duty station in the Army.
Okay, all right.
was
You
in-
became a police officer there.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
I actually went to Fort Leonard Wood, we call Fort Lost in the Woods, for my chemical training and basic, and then went to Benning for jump school as airborne, and then ended up in Fort Hood and ETS'd out of the Army there. I just had my youngest one in February, and I got out in May. Both her dad and I were slotted for deployment, so since I just had her, it was the choice for me to get out. And I had her in February, got out in May, and then got on the federal SWAT team and got hired on in December.
You and I have talked, so many times since that day happened. And I think I may have asked you many questions. I don't know if there's any questions I have not asked you about that. And you have been very, very gracious to put up with me in the many times that we have talked.
Your families.
But you were washing your car that day. And when you heard the first call, I don't know if I've ever asked you that question of what the first call was that you remember hearing that day.
It was shots fired in my sector, and I had called out 10-6 to wash my patrol car. So two other sector officers, which was Alpha and Charlie, because I was Bravo, got called to the shots fired. But again, it's not alarming to get shots fired, especially during the day, because it's usually, I say usually, most of the time it's funeral volleys practicing, and somebody calls it in the shots fired. So, but, I stopped washing my patrol car, got in and called dispatch saying that I was 10-8 en route, and was closer than anyone else, any other officer on base. And on the way is when dispatch said they could hear the shots being fired in the background. So that's when I knew that it was not, false alarm.
And you told me once about when you got out, you engaged Hassan. You both fired at each, but it was before you fired your first shot was the laser sighting. You still remember that? Does that still play in your mind?
Yeah, because first of all, there's an influx of 600-700 soldiers that come into these 5 buildings and this dome. So it's technically 7 buildings. And the only description we had was a white male in ACU, so that doesn't narrow it down.
I was going to say there's only about 700 or 800 people.
And so we were going into a blind situation, not knowing what was going on, which building it was in of the 5 rectangular buildings. We knew it wasn't the dome building. So when we pulled on scene, it was the other soldiers that were standing by and hiding and giving hand and arm signals as to where he was located. And I didn't even know Sergeant Todd was behind me, and got out of my patrol car and ran left up a slight incline, and I heard the shots first, but it didn't sound like a normal weapon that we fire all the time. It literally sounded like a nail gun. It didn't have the recoil loudness. And then I heard Sergeant Todd say, "Drop your weapon," and the shots continued to be fired. And that's when I saw the red laser come across my eyes and my chest, and realize, crap, this is him. I mean, there's soldiers running everywhere, but being able to put eyes on the actual, suspect and seeing the red laser, that's when it kicked in. Okay, I've got to get a shot. I got to stop this guy, because he was shooting people between us also.
Where did you get? You got hit in the.
I didn't get hit on that initial.
No, but you got hit first in the leg. Is that where you got hit first, or was it the shoulder?
No, when he ducked behind the building, and then I flanked him and ran into where we call it prone. You get on your stomach. I used the corner of the building as cover, and he, as I predicted, came out on the other side and started to engage him. And then when he knew I was engaging him, he returned fire, and that's when it hit me in the hand.
Okay.
But my head was right behind my hand, so I ducked because I didn't want to get, hit in the head. I ducked back behind the building, and when I heard a lull is when I peeped back around and saw that he was still closing distance. And stood up, took a couple of steps back, and then he came around the corner, and that's when I got the next shot hit my femoral, and then the next shot hit my knee.
And you were returning fire the whole time?
Yes, until I hit the ground.
Right.
And the butt of my weapon hit the concrete, causing it to do a failure to extract and a malfunction on the weapon.
And then you told me that you still remember him coming up to you, and then his gun jammed.
Yeah, he came up to me, pointed at my head to do the last shot.
Not saying anything?
Not saying a word. We never exchanged any words until final court.
Yeah.
And he pulled the trigger, and it just went click. And, I was confused as still why mine, because I knew I'd not fired all my rounds, why mine was not firing at the time. And I was still trying to fire up at him when he...
With your other hand?
No, with
the same hand?
The hand I got hit in wasn't hit very bad. I could still function. Right. But my weapon wasn't, so I was trying to fire up at him, and then he walked up and tried to fire on me. And then when he realized his was malfunction, he didn't, I guess, think that mine was malfunction, so he kicked mine out of my hand and then tried to walk over there and pick it up. But where I'd shot him on his left side, he was paralyzed, so he couldn't use his left hand to pick up my weapon. And that's when he walked off and was able to fix his malfunction, basically drop. Either he had a malfunction because there was an unspent bullet that was laying beside me that I noticed, once I saw him go down. But he walked off and somehow fixed his malfunction. And Sergeant Todd came back around and challenged him again and shot him 2 more times after Hassan. He told him to drop his weapon. Hassan fired at him, and then Sergeant Todd hit him 2 more times and dropped him.
So you're down on the ground. Mm-hmm. Sergeant Todd comes over. Any more eye contact with Hassan?
Well, I could see him, that he was down, and and the other soldiers that were hiding underneath the cars could see that he was down. So Sergeant Todd immediately, when they saw him down, went up and kicked the weapon away from him, and these soldiers came out of nowhere, and I saw that he was down. So in the meantime, before, and I'll back up a little bit, when he started walking off, me still not knowing what was wrong with my weapon, I was going to try to reload. As he kicked it away from me, I was dragging my body over there to try to get it, because I knew I got to stop him. He's...
Mm-hmm.
Because he, again, on that side, he was shooting people between us. He was shooting people that was coming out of the building where he started at. And so when we finally saw him go down, that's when I scooted myself up against the building. And I knew I had an arterial wound and was trying to put pressure on it. And the soldiers came up and I said, I need a tourniquet. I need something. But I knew he was no longer a threat, because I saw Sergeant Todd go over there and take the weapon away from him, handcuff him and everything. And
do you remember being taken, you remember the tourniquet being put on, being taken to the hospital? Because at some point in time, they lost you at some point in time.
Yeah,
right
but
at
it
the
wasn't
hospital,
until
right?
surgery.
Yeah.
I was on scene for 43 minutes because there was rumors that there were more shooters, which there were, me and Sergeant Todd, but it was chaos.
Sure.
And initially I'd gotten stuck with an IV. The belts that they were using, the makeshift tourniquets, weren't working. I was still bleeding out. I was getting very weak where I couldn't speak. At first, I was still barking orders to, Sergeant Kinlaw to get my phone call, get Jaden picked up.
Geez, Mom, okay.
Yeah. And anyway, they came over, a medic came over and stuck me, and then they were going to move me to the shade on a November 5th day. It was still hot as you-know-what in Texas.
Yeah.
And when they moved me is when they yanked the IV out, and by this time my veins were collapsing, and because I'd lost so much blood.
Right.
And they thought about doing a litter carry 300 yards to the helicopter because EMS couldn't make entry, not being safe on scene. And finally, a truck, EMS truck, came on up close to the building. And right when they were about to load me, something happened where they thought there was another shooter, and they put me down. And then the truck started driving away, almost ran over me.
Wow.
And so then they used the truck as cover, in case there was another shooter. So then they put me into the side of the truck, and that's what's on national news, while they were loading at the same time a DOA on the back of the truck. Mm-hmm. And finally, over 45 minutes later is when I got to the hospital. I still was conscious.
You still remember all that, going to the hospital and everything else?
Yeah, and I was in a lot of pain from the knee shot, not from the other. And I just remember, can I have pain meds? Can I have pain meds? That's all I could whisper. And when they finally got me into the ER, into the trauma room, I just remember them saying, we're losing her. And they said, what blood type are you? I whispered O positive. And they said, all right, we're going to put you under anesthesia and do some surgery. And I said, thank you. And I woke up 9 hours later. But apparently, they'd lost me twice during that surgery.
Any remembrances other than,
I wish I could say I had like that
the
white light.
That was the question I was going to ask you. But you just remember saying thank you and then waking up later?
Yeah, and waking up like it was a bad dream, but then realized I was still in pain. And I thought maybe it was because when they finally, on scene, there was this medic that had a CLS bag and had an actual combat tourniquet on it. And once they put that on, it was stopped the bleeding. And that's what saved my life. And that was on me within 15 minutes after shooting. So otherwise I wouldn't be here. No one survives a femoral, arterial wound for 45 minutes. But
when's the first time you talked to Matthew and Jaden and Mom and Dad?
That night, the first person I called naturally was my father.
Had he already heard that you were involved?
He had already actually been on the phone with the surgeon. And he'd just gotten news that I'd been shot in the leg, that I was in surgery. He had no idea that it was as extensive as it was until he talked to the surgeon. When the surgeon said, we can't, guarantee that she's going to make it. We're still working on her, blah, blah, blah. So by the time I called him, he was very emotional. And he said, unbeknownst to me, though, I just thought the tourniquet that they'd strapped on was so tight, and that was the pain that I was in. I didn't, the bullets went into my right leg, but they didn't hurt. But I was like, maybe it's kind of felt like a sprained muscle or something, strained muscle. So I didn't know the extent of my own injuries, except for that I knew I had a femoral wound and I was awake and I was still alive. So when I got on the phone with my father, he said, we've already booked a flight, blah, blah, blah. And of course I'm like, Dad, you don't need to come out. I'll be back to work in a couple of weeks. I'm fine. No, we're coming out. Okay.
Oh, okay. Don't argue with that.
Matt was actually he had PCS to Fort Bragg a month prior, but he was on leave up in Pennsylvania and was working with his uncle when his own soldiers that were in the field from that day started calling him and said, we think it's Kim, so he was freaking out, and then got confirmation from my parents that it was me. And he had already booked his own flight, and but the Army ended up rebooking it or whatever, and so everybody came in the next day, pretty much.
Jaden was young, so when did she start finding out about all this? To the point where it started sticking with her? Because I've seen her kind of grow up over the years, but she was not very old at all, was she? Maybe... Not
at all, but she has very vivid memories, because one thing I don't do is shelter. I never sheltered her from what was going on. She was, right there when they're taking staples out. She called all my scars, which are, anywhere from 8 to 15 inches long, several of them on my legs, my snakes. And when they draw blood out of my knee, she was always there. She was fascinated, and that's why I'm hoping maybe she'll go into the medicine field. But she remembers a lot, even at 2.5 years old.
Really?
She remembers a lot, yes. She remembers coming in to the hospital because her godparents were taking care of her because Matt was gone and I was incapacitated. So when they finally brought her in, I think the second day, she'd ate too many bananas. She'd gotten sick,
Oh, boy.
Once I'd gotten to my own room, I was able to put myself in a wheelchair and, interact with her a lot more. But she was right there in the midst of it, and she can tell you the whole story to this day.
She is a tough young lady.
She is.
And to have that kind of knowledge at 2.5 is amazing. And to have that recollection.
I didn't want her to find out any information from anyone else but me throughout life. And that's why I decided, some people think, I'm a little bit too open with her about everything that went on, but I don't have any regret, because she can tell you the story just as good as I can, and tell you all about Hassan and all about his beliefs and the bad things that he's caused many people.
When did you realize, or when were you told about the whole terrorist and Allah Akbar. And when did you find out that stuff? Because I imagine you didn't know at the time.
No, I had no idea. He looked like
Just
any other white guy out there.
Yeah, and so when did you learn all of that other stuff? Was it in the days afterwards?
The next morning when they put his name on national media, I knew right away he was Muslim because of his name. Nadal Malik Hassan. I mean, you can't really. I knew right away, and that's when I was like, oh God. And then within a few hours after that is when I started getting some important people from Fort Hood come to brief me on some of his background and what he did. He's actually, was a psychologist, and we have to get on SWAT. We have to get mental evals every year in that same department. Luckily, I'd already gotten mine in March. He came to Fort Hood in May, and this was November, so I didn't get to have any interaction with him at all. But just learning, I thought honestly he was probably, and I hate to say this, E3 or E4, not wanting to go to deployment, which essentially is true. But someone who, or not wanting to return and just, kind of lost it. That's who I never imagined he would be an enlisted a commissioned officer, right, in the high rank that he was. So putting all that together, I knew, he was he had committed what he attempted was his jihad. I
had talked to you, I think the first time I talked to you, I talked to your dad, and then I talked to you, and I guess up in Washington, D.C. is where we first actually met. When you were going to the State of the Union address, and your dad was so kind and so patient, putting up with phone calls with me at the time. But you did an awful lot of interviews after that. I mean, you did Oprah, you did Larry King, and I hate to, as an interviewer, was there one that stands out for being really good, or was there one that stands out for being, oh my goodness, I can't believe they asked me that question? I mean, what was that like? I'm on this side of it, you're on the other side.
Nationally, yeah, it's a whole new ballgame. You being a friend of the family, I was comfortable with you. I can open up with you. I didn't know what to expect from national. I'd never dealt with national news. The very first interview that we did after the shooting was with Oprah, and bless her heart, she was given completely wrong information and I was so medicated. I don't know how I looked even presentable on TV, but
you look pretty good for what you went through, believe me.
And I don't even remember much of the interview, to be honest with you. But she had been given that I'd gotten shot in the head, information that I'd been shot in the head.
Really?
She was given a photo that with me with a shotgun firing it, thinking that it was from that day on scene with me having a bright big smile on my face.
Gracious.
So, which again, it wasn't her fault, but and we were in a tough situation because we didn't know how much information we could disclose, it being an ongoing case. So we had to be very vague with some of our answers and kind of round and about answering the same questions for almost all the national media until I learned that as a civilian part of federal, not being still in the military and being controlled by the military, that I could speak out a lot more. That the case was open shut. He was a murderer. He was going to get death row. So without violating a non-disclosure confidentiality agreement, that's when I started speaking out and giving more details about his history and what he had done prior. And essentially the Webster report was released, and after that it was kind of a open ball game to say whatever I wanted.
Did you you went to the State of the Union, we met up there in Washington, D.C. Did you enjoy that night?
I was in a lot of pain. I didn't get a lot of enjoyment, but it was a once in a lifetime,
Yeah, because we talked in the hotel afterwards, and at the time you told me that it was something that you're glad that, I think your words were you're glad you did it. Maybe not for the reason that you were there, but you're glad you did it though.
Well, my father got to attend as Richard Burr's other guest, and in the balcony I got to see him, and I got to sit beside the First Lady, and I got to be part of the presidential State of the Union. Anyone, no matter what president it is, who would get that opportunity, it's a once-in-a-lifetime deal. I don't regret that part. I do regret being used as propaganda for what I've seen happen, consecutively at State of the Unions afterwards. It's whatever is in the happening now, whatever is the and I'm not bashing media by no means, but whatever is important in the media, they're
Sure.
always going to have military at the State of the Union or a hero. They're always going to have important figures from other countries, and with me was Haiti. The earthquake in Haiti had happened, so I understand that part. But the afterwards, what we were promised, Mark and I, with the Fort Hood victims, I started having regrets for why I was invited over there instead of going itself. I'd still do it again, like I said, because my father got to go, and that's something he, probably never would have been able to do either.
That we walked on that journey for the victims of Fort Hood for 5 long years. Mm-hmm. The story that I did opened my eyes to everything, and for those of you who don't know, the attack was classified as workplace violence. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the victims of the attack could not get some of the benefits had it been classified as a terrorist attack. Mm-hmm. 5 years it took for that to happen.
Yes, and there's still, believe it or not, there's still some things that are being backlogged, but the majority of the whole mission is complete to getting their Purple Hearts. And a lot of people didn't understand there was several avenues that we could take to get their benefits. We could reclassify it as a terrorist attack. They could reword the Purple Heart verbiage to include domestic terrorism, which is essentially what they did, giving them the Purple Heart. But a lot of people think, well, it's just an award. No, being a recipient of a Purple Heart allows you to get those benefits. Correct. As if you were overseas and gotten shot. And now there's still some back pay that, that's DFAS is just slow on. But, once they've got given the Purple Hearts 5 years later, then they were opened up to the benefits that they've been neglected from.
And it seems, have you ever met, because I have you ever met a Purple Heart recipient who was wounded, say, in Vietnam or some of the other conflicts overseas, who didn't want it to happen?
Yes, actually, there was some resistance in it.
Right, because I've met some as I was interviewing people for this. How did those conversations with you go? I mean,
it was more or less reading things that people had said. I didn't interact with anyone face to face that was resistant of it. Yeah. But and I can understand. I try to take everyone's point of view into concept, but one of the victim's wife, makes it clear to understand is that the war came to them. They were on their way to war, these victims, and they weren't, over the ocean fighting it, but they were about to, and the war came to them. There is no difference, and the majority of the people out there, part of the Purple Heart Association, agreed that there was no difference, that they deserved it. Otherwise, it would be just like them doing PT and spraining their ankle. Which they would get treatment for that injury, but they would not get the benefits. The
benefits is what for the Alonzo Lunsford. It's the benefits that he needs basically to be able to get up in the morning.
But everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and you can never make everyone happy. There's always going to be people, no matter what subject it is, that they're not going to agree on, whether they're a recipient, whether they're part of the military. We had people in our own military that was chastising the event. People chastising me who has never stepped foot a day in law enforcement, saying, well, the reason why I got shot is because I didn't wait for backup. No, that's not how it happens when you have an active shooter to preserve life and prevent further harm and injury. As a police officer, you sacrifice yourself singly if you are by yourself, and then if not, with another officer or 2 more officers, and you go direct to threat and you take it out, knowing that you're probably not going to make it out. That's just a sacrifice and part of the oath that you take.
And that's why that comes with wearing the badge.
Yes.
Can you share with me at all what some of the brass said on the day the Purple Hearts were awarded, what they said to you that maybe were fighting against it afterwards? I mean, did any of them share any words? I'm sorry, I apologize, this took too long.
Well, of course, that's what they're supposed to say. It was by the book. It was, the good thing is General Cone, bless his heart, he's now passed away, suffered from brain cancer. He was a general that day, and he was the best general I've ever had in my entire life. and he came back sick that day and spoke at the recipients award ceremony, and just his presence being there is something that'll always just stand out for me. But the other ones that were not part of Fort Hood, of course it doesn't have as much meaning when they stand up there and, read off of a piece of paper. The Secretary of the Army was there, and Sean Manning had the Purple Heart was delivered to the victims on that day, but actually they were granted to them on, I think, the end of February on their OPMF file. So technically they could file for the benefits then, whether they had the Purple Heart in hand. The citation was on their file. And the morning of, Sean Manning had put in the request for the benefits whenever it came on his OPMF file. That morning of the award ceremony, the Army told him that he was denied once again. So when we found that out, we had a pretty cesspool media conference after the award ceremony, and I let them have it, and a lot of them, one media, I can't remember who, said, what would you say when you have the governor of Texas here, you have your senators here, you have the Secretary of the Army here, what would you say? I said, well, the politicians standing over there, I don't need to say anything because they're on our side, and that's why we are here today, because of them being on our side. So I don't have to say anything to them, but I can tell you this, we're going to fight even harder than we've been fighting for the last 5 years until they get awarded their benefits. And it wasn't 9 days later that the Secretary of the Army made a declaration, an amendment to give them their benefits. So the pressure was put on, and it worked.
Yeah, and the right time. You're now with Step Up for Soldiers, which seems to me like it's almost the absolute perfect place for you to be. But people don't understand, you're not paid for this. This is done because you want to do it.
Yeah, I've helped and supported Step Up for years, and it's gotten to a point where we are going to and have started to pay some of our people, but it's an all-volunteer organization, and that's still in the making. It's still not final. It's still not... it's just gotten so big. Our organization has grown so much that we can't expect somebody to donate 40 hours a week of their time, especially someone who's not retired and gets benefits, who needs to work. Right. And that's how much we've grown. That's where we wanted to be. We're the major veteran organization in the Southeast, the biggest one, and it's something that came from the dream of Tom Russell in 2004. He's retired Port City police officer who moved down here, and he just started building ramps, and it grew and grew. And as he got older, he wanted to build a house for a veteran who was going through school and who was married with kids, to promote the stability of marriage and education and further their education. And so that was completed, the Kramer House. In January, we had the ribbon cutting and put a family in there. And our next step is to do another house for another veteran who's going through school. And, essentially we want to possibly do a community for veterans, even homeless veterans. I mean, there's so much that a lot of people come to us for their nonprofit charity. They want to give, they want to do something, an event to benefit Step Up. And so it's definitely a full-time job.
Yeah.
We have mostly our volunteers, our core, have other jobs, but with the flexibility of being able to work the events. Luckily, with me, I'm full-time student. I've been going to school for years. I can't get enough education. I want to learn more. It's like I'm a sponge. Single parent and doing Step Up, it's tough at times. And, we're going to be working on with UNCW to do a recruitment for other core members. But again, finding that perfect person who has the time to donate a lot of their time, that's going to move us to the next level. We don't, essentially we wanted to kind of do national, but I think we want to stay more regional. We can do more within our community than to reach out nationally and help other nonprofits and other communities grow, veteran nonprofits grow to help their, we think that it's easier to give back if you start local and then encourage other local charities to prosper
and
to go national.
Teach others the best practices and help them in their towns and their cities where they can.
The overhead is cheaper when you don't have to do national. And to give you an example, if I give, and I don't want to dime out any national nonprofits, but most of them, every dollar that you give, 7 cents goes towards the veteran or the soldier. And when you keep it local, every dollar that you give, 93% or 93 cents of the dollar goes to the veteran or to the soldier.
Where are you in your life now? Jaden's growing. You're doing Step Up. You're going to school. You help Dad in Carolina Beach. You're so nice enough to take a phone call when I call you. But where are you in your life now? Are you in a good place?
I am. I still consult for the government. I still do motivational speeches across the United States. I still teach and instruct at law enforcement conferences across the United States. I still have my hands in a lot of things. Now, the school virtue of it is my new knack is cyber crime, and something that I feel like I'm already good at, but I want to have a degree, because I think, and this is going into philosophy again, I think our society is at very big risk right now because of the cybercrime and the cybersecurity lacks out there. And that's now pretty much our biggest threat to mankind, other than conventional warfare, is the internet. And as much as it's advanced us, it's crippled us. And it's another fascination of mine is to continue until, if I'm disabled, I can't do like I used to do. I can't be in the front line of a SWAT team. So maybe I can be behind the scenes. And it's something that I'll always further myself to do until I can't type anymore. I can't see anymore.
You once told me that there was talk about a book. There was once talk about a movie about what happened on that November day in 2009. Where's all that? Is that ever going to happen?
It will. Life catches up with you, and Step Up, things going on with Step Up and the events, and it's been on the back burner, but it's not forgotten. It's still going to be done. It's finding the time.
I know, but you still seemed, every time we sit down and talk, whether it's in this venue or whether it's for on air or whether we're just at a Step Up concert when we did the first one out there in Monkey Junction, you still seem to me as if you have so much left to say.
Oh, I do.
Maybe not necessarily about what happened that day, but what happened in the weeks and months and years afterwards. There's
so much. There's not only the anti-terrorism part of it and what's happened with the actual story with the victims, the events that's happened in my personal life, the things that I see with other officers that go through, life-threatening injuries and what it does to their families, the divorce rate after, officers, not even after they've been injured, just being in law enforcement, the cumulative PTSD that happens over the last 6 years. There's so much that, and keeping my spirituality and trying to be unbiased, in a book that's sort of, Christian based, to encourage someone else who maybe not be so spiritual or religious. But the things that I've learned personally, it's not going to work for everyone else. I'm mentally and psychologically, I'm happy with my life. I've never been enjoyed solitude so much. I never thought I would, because I'm such an active social person. My focus in life is my children and my family, and then it's to the community. It's to help anyone else that I can. Prevent anything that I can prevent that I've had to go through personally. Dealing with national media is a whole different monster. And learning how to curb that and use that to an advantage and flip it. The national media became my best friend eventually. It was my worst enemy at first.
Right.
But using them as a platform for the victims of Fort Hood, or using them as a platform to boost Step Up for Soldiers, is something that took a while to master. And there's always an advantage to whatever disadvantage you have. And the book would be 20 chapters long if I could put everything in it. And finding that common ground is just the hardest part of the.
Well, I have learned to never doubt that you're going to put your mind to something. Never doubt that you'll do whatever you put your mind to do.
Yeah.
So don't be surprised if you're walking past a bookstore one day and you see a publication written by Kimberly Munley. Until that time, she plans to continue to do great work as president of Step Up for Soldiers. And if you'd like to help that group, join them at stepupforsoldiers.org. If you know someone who you think would make a good interview for an upcoming episode of One on One, drop me an email at jevans@wect.com. You can also reach out to me on Facebook or Twitter. I'm on those social media sites every day. I'm John Evans. Thanks for being with us for this episode of One on One.